We have Jamie Imus, who's an insurance and financial advisor with the Barkley Team at Country Financial, who is also an event sponsor. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors here for the Small Farm Expo. The Barkley Team at Country Financial are a local insurance specialist with an emphasis on small and medium-sized farms. The team will outline what you need to know in order to mitigate liability, employment, and financial risks. Bring your products to market and or sell your products directly to consumers. So without further ado, Jamie Imus.
I saw a big liability risk there, so I wanted her to come down first.
I was wanting to hold your hand.
Yeah, exactly. Annika first had me scheduled at 6:30 this morning because that's when the good insurance topics always usually happen, but I talked her into a little bit later on. This is going to be less of me talking, more of me trying to answer your questions, but I figured in order to get some questions, we should probably set the stage a little bit. So a lot of times I have folks that come to me, first off kind of going, okay, great, I've been doing this thing, and I just realized that I should probably have insurance because I sell these eggs to my neighbors, or I give this stuff away to these folks, but they let me use their tractor, in exchange for that. Is that a risk, or, am I covered for that kind of thing? And we end up having to kind of go through this whole discussion. So just to kind of get started, when are you an actual business? And when do you go from, I kind of describe it, and I hope I'm not insulting somebody, I kind of describe it as, at one point if you're growing vegetables, you're either gardening or you're farming. And the differentiator for me is, are you receiving anything, whether it's money or services in kind for what you're giving to somebody else? So if there's an exchange of value, whether it's green paper bills for my wallet, or it's, hey, you can use my tractor and I'll take your eggs. If there's an exchange for value, that's a commercial exposure. Anytime there's an exchange of value, so therefore there is a risk there. Do you itemize your expenses associated with your growing operation, whatever you grow? If you're itemizing those expenses, you are most likely a business, whether you realize it or not. And certainly if you hire anybody to do some work for you in and around your business, you are a business and you have that kind of commercial exposure. Quick history lesson, back in the 20s, our founders were actually a bunch of farmers in the middle of Illinois, and the only things that were available were either personal insurance or commercial insurance. And commercial insurance was not built for farmers. It was really expensive. It was built for businesses and manufacturers, in cities and that sort of thing, and farmers just couldn't afford it. So if something would happen, they would just get wiped out. So back in the 20s, this group of folks in Illinois created farm insurance, which was a mix of personal insurance and commercial exposure that was kind of unique to a farmer. So that was kind of our beginnings, our birth back in the mid-20s in Illinois. So what are we trying to do if we are a business to protect ourselves? Well, there's two things you have to protect. You have to protect your stuff, your investment in your property, your tractors, your equipment, your barns, your trucks, all your stuff. If something happens to it, you don't want to all of a sudden, you can't go to harvest because all your tractors, got burned up in the barn, right? And now you can't actually make any money to replace those things. So obviously there's a need to protect your stuff. The second need is to protect your money, to protect your income. You have what's called liability, meaning if you do something wrong, whether on purpose or an accident, there needs to be some amount of coverage for that so that you don't get wiped out personally. So let me give you some quick stories of what that means. Can't really see these pictures, and I apologize. A little bit washed out because of the lights in here. But these are, you probably recognize what these are, right? Deer. Can't recognize what this is. This is strawberries growing in a field. Anybody grow strawberries? Anybody grow vegetables? Anywhere near where there might be trees and wildlife coming in and out? How easy is it to stop wildlife from coming into your crops? It's not very easy, is it? It's impossible, nearly impossible. Well, here's a story that just happened 2 years ago with deer in strawberry fields down in Oregon for one of our farm clients. Strawberries were harvested, strawberries were picked, strawberries were packaged, sent out. 3 small children developed E. coli from where they tracked deer to the fields where it probably developed. So Country wrote a $3 million check to the families that were affected by the E. coli on behalf of that farmer. That would have wiped that strawberry farmer out, period. No way to really control whether or not that kind of situation is going to happen, but since it's tracked back to his farm, it's his liability. Another example, you probably hear about this one probably more so than anybody have a cow or a horse that has ever gotten out, or a goat or a lamb. So animal collisions happen all the time. I don't want to say all the time because I see them all across the entire state. They're not happening all the time, in the middle of Linden. But they happen a lot more so than we realize. And when a car or a truck collides with an animal, even if for some reason we think it was the car's fault, it's going to be the animal owner's fault. Always. I've never seen a case go against the driver of the vehicle. It's always going to be the animal owner's fault because they're on a public road. Even if it was on a private road even, it's still going to be the animal owner's fault. If you have a homeowner's policy that doesn't include your farm and your commercial operations, your insurance company will say, that's not ours. Sorry. So that's why it's important when you do have animals, even if you're not producing a lot of revenue, you need to make sure your homeowner's policy endorses for things like animal collision. So there's a few carriers in Washington that will do it, even if you don't have a full-fledged farm, and Country's one of those. Because it's not just the vehicle damage, you're talking about potentially medical expenses. Heaven forbid somebody loses their life in that accident. We'll talk about the extent of what that risk is here in a minute. And then finally, retail sales. How many people sell food at a farmer's market or a roadside stand on their property? So once you're interacting with the public on a one-to-one basis, you're now, in a sense, retailing, right? Just a suit that happened a year and a half ago to one of my clients. A person at the farmer's market had glasses around their neck, hanging from their neck, and they were reaching through getting vegetables and somehow got tangled up with the plastic bag, and when she turned away, it ripped the glasses from, her neck, and, she kind of fell over, and so all of a sudden we had a person with injuries, right? And regardless of how we feel about who was really at fault there, at the end of the day, it's the vendor's liability. Somebody's going to sue. It's not going to be the vendor, suing for lost bags or damage to their table, the customer. But the customer is going to sue to figure out how they get their medical expenses taken care of because she went to the doctor and she had an injury, her glasses were a few $100s, this sort of thing. That's all. That risk is something you as the retailer bear out unless you pay an insurance company to cover that for you and cover that liability. The biggest expense, the most common expense associated with that is not the payout. It's not the payout to the customer for the glasses and the medical injuries. It's the defense cost. How many of you want to pay a lawyer to defend you in a case that you're never going to lose because everybody's going to say it's not your fault? How would you like to take on $10,000 or $20,000 worth of defense costs just to prove you're right? Anybody want to offer up that check? We'll start a GoFundMe right now. We'll just have a pool ready for people. That's the primary obligation of an insurance company, is to defend you in court, even if you're not liable. We take on those costs for you. Okay? That's the first line of defense. So, why is this a risk? And I'm sorry it's washing out here. I'm just going to read it to you what we're talking about here. Your stuff is at risk. Net worth, kind of a fancy terminology for all your stuff, all the stuff you own, minus all the stuff you owe, your debts, gives you a net worth. So say your farm's, I'm going to use random numbers here, say your farm's worth $1 million, but you owe $500,000 on that farm, and everything else that's attached to it. So you have a net worth of $500,000, right? Simple math. $1 million minus $500,000 equals $500,000, right? So not only is your net worth at risk in a lawsuit, but 25% in the state of Washington, 25% of your future income can be garnished to pay off a liability judgment. How much income do you pay yourself a year? Or how much income do you make from that second job? Do you make $50,000 a year? Well, let's just make it simple. Do you make $40,000 a year? What's 25% of that? $10,000, right? How many years are you going to work? Another 20? Another 30? That adds up quick, right? We went from $10,000 a year to all of a sudden 20 years, $200,000, 30 years, $300,000. Do you make more than $40,000? That math adds up quick. You can hit $1 million like that. So that's what's really at risk when we talk about all this. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we, now that we're thinking about being a business, we're thinking about selling at the farmer's market, we're thinking about wholesaling out to Whole Foods or the co-op or whatever it is. Two things you can do to protect yourself. One, you can incorporate. Incorporation just means basically creating a shell around your business that shields your personal assets from your business assets. So that if somebody tries to sue you, they sue the business, not you personally. Does that make sense? A number of ways you can do that. You can go directly to the Washington Secretary of State's, just Google it, Secretary of State's website, create an LLC, give it a formation, they walk you through it, it's a little checklist, you pay them $55, I think it is, you're incorporated. Every year you have to file articles of incorporation. They've got a little website for that too at the state of Washington. Click through, pay your $50, you're incorporated. There's online resources, LegalZoom and other online legal databases where you can print out forms for different types of corporations. Hire an attorney. There's tons of local attorneys in town, even brand new attorneys that are really good at setting up a simple corporation in a matter of minutes. And it might be $100, might be $200. But meet with somebody to kind of figure out what's the best type of corporation for me. Second piece is obviously to insure. When you're asking somebody to insure your farm or insure your business, you're saying, I take on all the risk right now. Would you be willing to take on most of these risks for this much money? Right? So you got to pay somebody else to take on those risks. That's what you're doing with insurance. If you want to sell at a farmer's market, if you want to wholesale to another retailer or vendor, you're typically going to be required at minimum to have $1 million liability on your policy. Even if you don't insure any of your barns, any of your equipment, you're going to be required to have $1 million worth of liability. Okay? But for you as a business, you want to think about, what do I have to insure? What are the critical pieces to my operation that if I didn't have them, I couldn't actually get my product to market? Is it the tractor? Is it the barns? Is it some other piece of equipment? Make sure you're insuring those so that if something happens right before harvest, you're not all of a sudden, I can't bring in the harvest and we're going to lose all this year's crop. Do you have unique exposures where there's certain things about your operation that lend themselves to a little bit more danger or a little bit more risk than the average person? I don't mean this to sound critical of any type of farming operation, but when I think about it, I think about if you're spraying things, whether they're chemicals or they're organics or whatever, there's a little bit higher risk than if you're not spraying things. If you've got ponds for any sort of purpose, those are a little bit more risk than people who don't have ponds or settling fields on their property. There's more risk associated with that. So those unique exposures are going to be why you'd want to actually sit down and talk with somebody about, here's what I got, tell me what I got at risk. Does that make sense? So that's it. I figured that's enough scaring you for one day. We have a little booth up here at front. You can certainly jump on our website, email us, phone us, set up an appointment, and then talk with us. Our meeting is free. It's at our cost. We'd love to meet with you and kind of sit down and help you make sure you can kind of keep doing what you're doing for a long time and do it profitably. So with that, let's just kind of open it up to questions and test my knowledge. Or we can all just go have coffee. Up front.
What? Is there anything different or anything special about
a great question. The question was, I don't think you have your microphone on. The question was, is there anything special we need to do if we want to do something else besides grow our crop, like Airbnb, an outbuilding or something like that? Absolutely. I loved this last session because how many times do you find a business opportunity? As a farmer, we're always trying to find another way we can get revenue in, right? How many times do you find a business opportunity that's going to pay for itself within 18 months? I can initialize that project for basically 25 cents on the dollar. That's awesome. But I've now got liability exposure and property exposure with those solar panels. So there is special things that you need to do because farming is one type of business. When you add another type of business like Airbnb, or I'm selling power back to the grid, or I'm selling honey, or I'm animals, you know, those are all different types of exposure. The great thing about farm insurance is it covers a lot of those things in general. But sometimes we have to add other endorsements. I just wrote a farm from some folks that were here at the Expo last year who are Airbnb one of their buildings to folks, and it's awesome. Their current policy had no coverage for that. Not only did it have no coverage for the building, no coverage for the liability if something happened to people while they were staying there. So we had to add an endorsement for frequent rentals of that building, and we did. It's just a cost, I think, was something like $300 or $400 a year for that exposure, which seems like a lot of money, but if you're making a few $1,000s a year or tens of thousands of dollars a year off that Airbnb, well, that's what it takes to be in that business. You're basically being a hotelier at that point. So that's a great question. Yes, you got to talk to somebody about that. We'll try the mic again.
What about farm-based events?
What about farm-based events, or you're going to have to speak up because the microphone's still not working?
Opening your farm for tours.
Oh yeah, so tours and farm-based events. We have a lot of farms that are now doing, fall festival or involved with like Skagit Valley's fall festival, family farms, and they're on the tour, and all that stuff is normally great until it starts involving something that has some innate risks to it that's a little outside the norm. Things like a pumpkin trebuchet, or a pumpkin cannon that you can shoot off into the field, or helicopter tours that are landing in your field to go tour the valley. Those are some high-risk exposure that puts the public at risk, that I literally had to sit down with these folks and say, okay, how much money are they wanting to pay you to land their helicopter in your field? Okay, here's the problem. For that much money, even if it's $2,000, you are so exposed that if something happens to the helicopter, if it falls over, if it crashes, if it injures 10 more people on your farm because of something it did, you're on the hook, as well as the helicopter company. They're not going to stop at the helicopter company. They're going to go to you, your field, you're the owner of the field, so we'll help you kind of decide, is it worth the risk of taking on that extra revenue, or they have to pay you this much to do that at my property, right? We have to make this much on this type of farm event in order to justify it, the risk of the rest of our farm. So anything's possible. You just have to meet with somebody that you trust to be able to say, is this worth it? Can we make enough money to cover the cost of this thing? And I've honestly had folks that go, yeah, it's just not worth it. Folks that they want to allow folks to hunt on their property, but they are worried that somebody's going to trip and fall in a divot in one of their fields, and a gun's going to go off, they're going to shoot somebody. So at some point they kind of have to say, okay, unless we're willing to go out and spend a lot of money to get somebody to insure me for firearms hunting on my property, which was going to be a lot of money, I just got to say no to everybody because I can't afford the risk. And as much as we want to think some release of liability on a piece of paper that somebody signed is going to cover me, it's not up to you. It's up to a jury or a judge. And so how much do you want to spend to be right? Because you're going to bear the defense costs if the insurance company goes, we don't insure for that. Makes sense? Follow-up question, sorry.
Farm something. Farm thing.
Yep.
And also statement about liability from Washington State.
Yeah.
Farm.
Disclaimers, and once you step foot on our property, we're no longer responsible. Those are Let me equate it to this. Do you have deadbolts on your door? Is that going to stop somebody from getting into your house? But it's a deterrent, right? Okay. A signed document, none of that stuff is going to 100% of the time protect you from anything that happens. It's strictly a deterrent and a warning. You might be right, you might no longer be held liable, but how much money are you going to spend in court to prove that? That's the question. It's all good stuff. I won't ever tell you don't do it. Absolutely. But it's not going to protect you 100% of the time. Sometimes it's not necessarily going to affect how much you're charged. It may affect whether or not they're going to insure you at all. In the back.
What do you recommend insurance rent hire for hay, potatoes? I have pond, I have wells. Just like that, sometimes insurance, you just want to get hurt. Like potatoes.
Are you the landowner or are you the renter? So the question was, what type of insurance, if you're leasing land, potatoes, hay, other crops, it really applies to anything, leasing land, because you do have ponds and other structures. You're the landowner? Okay. So two things, you want to make sure that you're protected as the landowner from any sort of liability, but more importantly, you want to make sure that your tenant, whoever's leasing the land from you to do those crops or work that land, is also insured, and here's the key, names you as an additional insured on their policy. And the terminology for this is you require a certificate of insurance from them proving that they have insurance and naming you as an additional insured. That way their insurance company will defend you in court in case it is something that they're liable for that happened, or if somebody, they pick potatoes and somebody gets sick off their potatoes and they decide to sue them, and then they find out it was from your land and decide to sue you too, your insurance company is going, well, wait a minute, you're never going to be found liable and we're never going to pay on this policy. They need to defend you. So that's why you need that proof of insurance from them. One more quick question here because we're running out of time, and I'll follow up with you right afterwards. It's working.
Yeah, as a beekeeper, I move bees around the colony of blueberries and raspberries. I sell farmers market honey as well as on my front porch. Now, if I move bees to growers raspberries, I'm covered under this policy.
Yes, so that's a great question, because a lot of times on a farm policy, cargo coverage or the transportation of your cargo from farm to farm is not covered, is usually specifically excluded. You can add that coverage, but this is something that a lot of people miss, is they don't realize that, they just assume, well, it's my bees, my truck, you insured both of those things over here, you'll insure it over there too. Yeah, but the farm policy typically doesn't automatically cover it in its transportation to and from. So you got to make sure that that's added, cargo coverage is added in that particular scenario. Yeah. Hey, thanks for sticking around and listening to a bunch of insurance stuff. Hope I didn't scare you too much, but feel free to stop by the booth. We'll set up a time to meet in person in the office or at your farm. We'd love to see your operation and see how we can help. Thanks.